The early 1940s was undoubtedly one of the darkest times in the long history of Rome. The city was under a brutal German occupation. Thousands of people found themselves on the run from the authorities. These included Jews, communists, and Allied prisoners of war. If caught, they faced certain death. In this situation, the most unlikely of heroes emerged. His name was Hugh O'Flaherty, an Irish priest born in Cork in the late 19th century, and he would go on to organise an escape line that would save thousands of people and in the process risk his own life. This video tells his remarkable story. Before we set off on this fascinating history, let me introduce myself. My name is Finn Dwyer. I'm an Irish historian and I'm also the creator of the Irish History podcast, so you'll find hours of fascinating history over there. I've that linked beneath this video. But now to start the remarkable story of Hugh O'Flaherty, let's return to Ireland in the closing years of the 19th century when his remarkable life began. There was very little in Hugh O'Flaherty's early years to suggest that he would become such an important figure in the Second World War. So he was born outside the village of Kishkeam in Cork, although he was raised in Kerry. This is very far from the major centres of power in Europe at the time. Hugh O'Flaherty's early years are largely uneventful. His father was a member of the Royal Irish Constabulary, serving as a policeman, although he does leave the force in 1909 to take up a position as a steward of a golf club outside Killarney. Hugh O'Flaherty himself will actually become a very proficient golfer, and that would be very useful to him in the Second World War. Now, the first signs that he's, I suppose, an unusual or maybe remarkable man is when he goes to school, because Hugh O'Flaherty proved himself to be academically very gifted. At the age of 15, he was already working as an auxiliary teacher in his school, and then after this he starts to pursue a career in the church, so he wants to become a priest, and that's a source of great pride in Ireland at the time. Priests are highly respected, so it's understandable that someone like O'Flaherty would enter the priesthood. Now, at this point he is hoping to become a missionary priest, basically work outside Ireland in places like Africa, South America, maybe Asia. However, at a very early stage in his career, he's spotted as a very talented guy, and this is actually what brings him to Rome. He moves to Rome in 1922 and he'll actually spend most of his life in the city. So that explains how this guy, born in the west of Ireland in 1898, ends up at the heart of Europe in one of Europe's great cities during the Second World War. But next we need to look at what Hugh O'Flaherty did between 1922 and 1943, because in those years he becomes a very powerful figure in the Vatican, but also gains a certain degree of experience around the world as well. By the late 1920s, Hugh O'Flaherty has actually risen quite substantially, and he's one of the most senior Irish clerics in the Vatican. He's working as the vice-rector of the Propaganda College in Rome, but from there he also starts to go on to take up other roles in the Vatican, and in the 1930s he actually enters the Vatican's diplomatic service. And in this role, Hugh O'Flaherty travels around the world. He works in Africa, the Caribbean, but perhaps most importantly, in the late 1930s, he is in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia is one of the countries where political tensions that will ultimately lead to the Second World War are rising sharply. So Hugh O'Flaherty, while he is in the Vatican, he's certainly not removed from the wider world around him. And in the late 1930s, he's got first-hand experience of the tensions that are rising all across the continent. But next, let's look at the outbreak of the Second World War, because this is what will transform Hugh O'Flaherty's life and lead him to take remarkable risks, revealing him to be such an incredible figure in the Second World War. In 1939, at the outbreak of the Second World War, Hugh O'Flaherty is back living in the Vatican in Rome, and this leaves him with a ringside seat to the Second World War as it plays out across Europe. Don't forget, had he been living in Ireland, Ireland remains neutral in the conflict. The situation in the Vatican is very, very different. So the Vatican is obviously located in Rome, and Italy in these years is ruled by the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. He's a close ally of Adolf Hitler, and in 1940 he will actually go to war on the German side in the Second World War. However, the situation in the Vatican is somewhat delicate. So since 1929, the Vatican had become an independent state essentially. So it will remain neutral in the conflict, but it's tiny and surrounded by Rome. So essentially it's an island of neutrality in a fascist dictatorship that's at war with the Allies from 1940. Now, in the early stages of the war, Hugh O'Flaherty doesn't do anything necessarily exceptional. He does start to see the impact of the war, however, when he visits prisoner of war camps in northern Italy. So let's look at what happens when Hugh O'Flaherty meets Allied prisoners of war in northern Italy, because this does appear to have been a transformative event in his life. Through the early 1940s, the Germans and their Italian allies scored a series of victories against the Allies, and it certainly didn't look great for an Allied victory in the conflict. But this led to considerable numbers of Allied troops being captured and put into prisoner of war camps in northern Italy. Now, the Vatican was allowed to visit these prisoners, and Hugh O'Flaherty, because he spoke several languages, was one of the priests selected by the Pope to go to these prisoner of war camps and basically see how the prisoners were being treated. And this becomes a really pivotal moment in Hugh O'Flaherty's life. When he visits the prisoner of war camps, he finds thousands of British prisoners of war. Now, instinctively, he might have had a degree of resentment towards them. During the Irish War of Independence, Hugh O'Flaherty himself had been arrested and roughed up by the Black and Tans back in his native Kerry, but very quickly what will become his trademark compassion comes out. And in these prisoners, Hugh O'Flaherty sees young men from British cities who are in desperate conditions. A lot of the time their families don't know where they are, they're being treated very poorly. And over time, Hugh O'Flaherty starts to push the boundaries of what he's allowed to do. Ultimately, he's just supposed to be there essentially as an observer by the Vatican. But very quickly, he feels very sorry and a lot of compassion for these prisoners. He starts, first of all, to give them supplies, and then as the war goes on, he gives them up-to-date information about how the war is going, tells them that the Italians aren't doing that well, particularly in North Africa, and this raises the morale of the troops. On top of this, when he returns to Rome, he carries the names of these prisoners and has them read out over Vatican radio, and this allows their families back home to find out that they're still alive, and this is a huge event. Now, this outrages the fascist authorities in Italy because they see this priest coming up from the Vatican, he's raising the morale of the troops. On top of that, he actually gets 2 camp commanders in these prisoner of war camps dismissed. And overall, this leads to a lot of complaints, and ultimately the Pope at the time, Pope Pius XII, will stop Hugh O'Flaherty conducting this work of going to the Allied prisoner of war camps. However, this does appear to have had a profound impact on Hugh O'Flaherty, and from this point on, he's no longer a bystander in the war that's unfolding around him. He starts to take an active involvement and showing remarkable compassion. Now, next I want to look at what happens in Italy in 1943, because that's a really pivotal year in the war, not only in Italy, but particularly in Rome itself. And this is where Hugh O'Flaherty becomes the incredible figure that will go on to save thousands of lives. In 1942 into 1943, the story of the Second World War starts to change. The Soviet Union defeats the Germans at the Battle of Stalingrad, and at the same time, the Allies start to score a string of victories in North Africa, and then in the summer of 1943 they push from North Africa into the island of Sicily, that's off the coast of Italy, and then they push onto the Italian mainland itself. Now, this has huge implications in Italy. First of all, Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator, is actually deposed, but Hitler becomes very worried about what's going to happen next. He fears the Italians are going to change sides, which they do. And in the summer of 1943, what happens is that the Germans occupy half of Italy, and this begins a brutal German occupation of Rome. Technically, the Vatican remains neutral, so the Germans don't occupy the Vatican City where Hugh O'Flaherty is living, but all around him, the Germans are occupying Rome, and they earn a reputation for brutality. On top of this, you get large numbers of people on the run from the Germans start to turn up in Rome, and this is where Hugh O'Flaherty starts to take, as I say, an active role, and he takes compassion on these. Some of them are Jews fleeing the Nazis. On top of that, you've got Allied prisoners of war also on the run, needing somewhere to stay, to hide out while they can escape the city. And the consequences for these people, had they been caught, was horrific. As you can imagine, Jews would end up in concentration camps, but so too would Allied prisoners of war, or they may well have been shot for escaping. So next I want to look at how Hugh O'Flaherty responds to this, and this is what actually earns him the name, the Oscar Schindler of Killarney. Given he had worked in the Vatican for nearly 2 decades by this point, Hugh O'Flaherty was very familiar not only with the Vatican itself, but also the city of Rome and all the properties the Vatican owned in the city, in convents, monasteries, different churches. He had become intimately aware of this. And at the same time, Hugh O'Flaherty had also become a very well-connected guy. He was a brilliant academic and highly respected in the Vatican. But on top of that, I mentioned earlier, he was also a really good golfer, and he used to play golf with very senior people in Rome. But it's around this time also that Hugh O'Flaherty becomes known as a guy who will help people. And this is what leads to what becomes a remarkable escape line. So very quickly it becomes known in Rome, particularly in 1943 when people are trying to escape the Germans, and there's thousands of people now desperately needing to escape. But it becomes known that this Irish priest in the Vatican will help people. O'Flaherty himself is a very visually imposing guy. He's 6'4", so he stands out in the crowd. And it's said that every evening he would stand on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and people would know he was the guy to go to. Now initially he starts to hide people in various different buildings around the city and in the Vatican itself. The risks, again, I will say, are immense. If he's caught doing this, he's not only going to be in trouble with the Vatican, but if he steps outside the Vatican, the Germans will also arrest him. Indeed, during the war, other priests were actually sent to concentration camps for this work. But Hugh O'Flaherty pushes on, and over time he builds up this elaborate network of people who are willing to help people on the run. And the group itself is an eclectic bunch of people. It includes the British ambassador in the Vatican at the time, a British soldier, Sam Derry, who was on the run, the wife of the Irish ambassador or minister to the Vatican at the time, a woman called Dunlea Kiernan. She's a remarkable figure. But they work together to try and help these thousands of people that are on the run, coming to Rome, needing somewhere to stay. And Hugh O'Flaherty oversees this, along with Sam Derry. The two of them are the leading figures in this group that spirit what will ultimately be about 6,500 people off the streets of Rome and to safety, and most of these people will end up surviving the war. But all this time, Rome itself is being occupied by the Germans, and the head of the Gestapo in the city, a man called Herbert Kappler, becomes very aware of what Hugh O'Flaherty is doing, and this will leave him in a very dangerous position in late 1943 into 1944. In the later years of the war, Herbert Kappler will embody the brutal German occupation of Rome. Through that occupation, they carry out numerous massacres in the city, and also, as I mentioned, they become aware that this Irish priest in the Vatican is helping Allied prisoners of war and Jews escape from the German authorities. And over time, Kappler makes it very well known that if Hugh O'Flaherty is caught outside the Vatican, don't forget the Vatican itself, this tiny city-state at the heart of Rome, is neutral. But if Hugh O'Flaherty is caught outside the Vatican, he will be arrested. Indeed, on one occasion, Kappler, as head of the Gestapo, is reputed to have sent 2 agents into the Vatican to kill Hugh O'Flaherty. Luckily, he does survive. Now, while the German occupation of Rome does end in 1944, I think one of the most remarkable parts of Hugh O'Flaherty's life is what he does at the end of the war and afterwards, because this guy displays remarkable compassion. Compassion I think I certainly wouldn't be capable of, but I want to share that remarkable end to the story with you next, because it really reveals what an incredible figure he was. The German occupation of Rome comes to an end in June 1944, just actually a couple of days before D-Day, when General Mark Clark leads forces into the city, pushing the Germans out. Now, ostensibly, this ends Hugh O'Flaherty's role in many ways, because you might think he's been helping prisoners to escape through Rome, and now Rome is back under Allied control. However, what Hugh O'Flaherty did next is just remarkable. He displays a level of compassion that I certainly don't think I would have in me. So what happens is, basically, the people who had hunted Hugh O'Flaherty, the Italian fascists and then the Germans, they become the ones who are hunted. But O'Flaherty goes on to show remarkable compassion to these people. He insists that they're treated fairly, that they're given due process. And this reveals a lot of his motivations during the war. He was driven by a compassion for other human beings. And regardless of who they were or what they had done, he always believed people should be treated fairly. Now, this is embodied by an action he takes after the war in a move that I think most people would be incapable of. So the head of the Gestapo in Rome, Herbert Kappler, had been captured at the end of the war. He's convicted and sent to prison. But every month, Hugh O'Flaherty visited Kappler in his prison. Very few other people did. And actually, Kappler would ultimately convert to Catholicism, and it would be Hugh O'Flaherty that would perform that conversion. Now, O'Flaherty himself was always dubious about why Kappler did this, but it is just incredible that he found it within himself to not only visit this man, but ultimately convert him to Catholicism. Now, the later years of Hugh O'Flaherty's life are underwhelming. Maybe it's something about the man, but he rarely spoke about what he had done during the war. Other people did speak about it. He was given several different awards for what he had done, but he himself was very reticent to talk about what he had done. Perhaps he was traumatized, but it also speaks to a man who was very humble. Now, in 1960, he is promoted again in the Vatican when he's appointed as papal nuncio to Tanzania. However, unfortunately, he actually suffered a stroke in 1960 and could never take up that position. And it's at this point in his life that he returns to Kerry and moves into an apartment above a shop in the town of Cahersiveen in 1960. And he will spend the following years in Cahersiveen, and you have to wonder what a change it must have been. Hugh O'Flaherty was a man who loved Rome. He actually wrote guidebooks on the city. And then he finds himself back in the west of Ireland, among a community, his own people essentially, but they had had a completely different experience of the war than he did. And he spoke very little about his wartime experiences in Rome, the risks he had taken or what he had seen. He did give one interview, and then in 1963, he did appear on a very famous TV show called This Is Your Life, and that was a tribute to his comrade in arms, Sam Derry, who he had worked with so closely in Rome. But Hugh O'Flaherty himself was always reticent to talk. Now, sadly, he would die in 1963 at the age of 65 and was certainly not remembered in Ireland at all for what he had done. Now this has started to change in recent years. There's a group in his native Killarney headed up by Jerry O'Grady who commemorate Hugh O'Flaherty's life and are committed to raising awareness, and they actually travel to Rome and see the places in the city associated with them. You are probably aware of Joseph O'Connor, the famous Irish writer. He's written a trilogy of books about Hugh O'Flaherty, and Hugh O'Flaherty's grandniece Catherine has also made a documentary about him. Now I actually interviewed all three of these, Jerry, Joseph O'Connor and Catherine O'Flaherty, in a podcast that you can find beneath this video. It's a much longer deep dive into Hugh O'Flaherty's life. It's really worth checking out. It's been released to mark a new stamp that's actually been released for Hugh O'Flaherty, and you'll find out more about that in the podcast. But it's great to see his life finally being acknowledged here in Ireland, because so long he wasn't exactly forgotten, but very few people would have known who Hugh O'Flaherty was, and less still what he had done. So it's great to see this remarkable man and the incredible things he had done being remembered in a fitting way. Now that's where I'm going to leave this video. If you're not subscribed to the channel, do subscribe. I've got a really great video coming out next week. It's all about life in a medieval castle. It's recorded in a restored medieval castle. That's really fascinating. You want to get that when it drops. So do subscribe to the channel if you've not subscribed yet. And thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Also drop a comment, a like below as well. I'll be talking to you next week. Until then, slán.